Hey everybody, my name is Emily Sweeney. I'm with the Boston Globe and the New England First Amendment Coalition, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this episode of 3 Requests, 3 Stories. This webinar is part of our ongoing series on public records laws, and you can check out our previous episodes on the New England First Amendment Coalition's YouTube channel and the website, nefac.org. Just click on the Freedom of Information Guide and you'll find all the previous episodes and a lot of other great information that can help you if you're looking for information on public records. This video series is brought to you by NEFAC with support from the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, MuckRock, SPJ New England, and the New England Society of News Editors. And leading today's session is Erin Siegel McIntyre. She's an investigative journalist and photographer who relocated from Mexico to join the journalism faculty at the University of North Carolina in 2020. And she's here to talk about federal FOIA with us. Erin, thank you so much for coming on and doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's always a pleasure to talk about FOIA, all things FOIA, especially at the federal level. So when we think about federal FOIA requests, there are a few things that we have to consider, right? Working at the federal level is significantly different than working at the local level, and it typically, sad but true, takes a little bit longer. So when you start to conceptualize a request for a federal agency, it is absolutely integral to think about the time frame and the scope of your project. And I use the word project intentionally instead of story because you might be working on a story, but if you're going to be filing federal FOIAs, you might as well think about it a little bit broader and fish around the edges a little bit and really try to get as much information as you can, bringing that story out of story mode up into kind of a bigger, I guess, conceit, if you will. So what you have to think about is your deadline for publication. If you're going to be FOIA-ing federal agencies, you can't rely on a time frame. If you have a quick turnaround of even a week or two, that could be too quick to get a response back. In most cases, it absolutely will be. And so you really do have to think about federal FOIAs in terms of like piecing together a puzzle. What's going to kind of come through when, which projects do I have rolling forward? And it's a bit of a juggling act. So then you also have to think about what happens if this story that I'm conceptualizing actually does have an expiration date, right? Are the requests I'm filing, what else can I use them for? Is there anything else I can potentially use them for? That's pretty important. And as with all public records requests, when you first start thinking about, okay, who has this information? How do I get it? You kind of have to use a really open mind and think creatively. I think a really good example of how you can incorporate federal FOIA requests into local work is thinking about joint operations. Like take an individual joint terrorism task force, for example, right? So according to the FBI, I think there's something like 200 different JTTF forces around the country today. That's, again, according to the FBI, I haven't fact checked them. And so that's a lot. And the way those particular task forces work are through cooperation, through interagency cooperation and through information sharing. And so if you have a tip, if you have sources talking to you about a story and you want to start fleshing things out and corroborating and fact checking, you can ask for the same kind of information, not just from one agency, but from many, right? And so that this particular example might involve, let's say, the FBI, local FBI field office, could involve immigration's custom enforcement, if it has something to do with immigration, or raids, deportation raids, could have to do with local cops, local sheriff's departments. You kind of have to think through, okay, who's involved? Where does information live? And kind of just make your request work like quadruple time. That's one way to think about federal requests. So getting started, of course, you have to think about how to file. I'm not going to spend time on that because the instructions are pretty clear. They're on each individual agency's website. And when you think about federal FOIAs, it's a lot like individual state level agencies. There are tons of them. They each have their banners. You have to follow the instructions pretty tightly. Don't mess up on stupid stuff like that. Follow it to a T and just check their individual websites before you go. Of course, there is also this nifty FOIA online portal. And the website for that is just foiaonline.gov. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that all federal agencies are not listed here. It is basically a bunch of excerpts. Some big agencies, a lot of DHS is on here, CBP is on here, but it's not everything. So if you are to set out to make a federal request, head over to this portal and you don't see the agency, it's not because they don't take FOIA requests. It's just because this portal doesn't encompass it. They haven't opted in. So keep that in mind. After you figure out the nuts and bolts of how to get your request into any particular system, I always highly recommend to make a phone call to that agency and talk to the FOIA officer. And I know that's kind of a standard piece of advice that you could use no matter what kind of request you're making. But I will say for requests at the federal level, I think it's even more important than usual, not only because it kind of gives, the person at the other end of the phone a heads up. You can get some information about, hey, how should I phrase this specific ask? I want to find out about this topic. What's the jargon? What are the files called? All that stuff is great to have and can really help a request get through the system. But when you're thinking federal, it's also a little bit about starting a relationship. And for better or for worse, these are long-term relationships, right? And you are responsible sort of for keeping the spark alive here. Your request could take years, literally years. And so the people on the other end of that phone, they might not be your friends, they might not be the most helpful, but then again, they actually might be helpful. You just don't know. You always want to create good relationships and be helpful yourself as a journalist by knowing what you're talking about, following through, staying on top of each request. Organization gets pretty important, especially if you're filing lots of requests and they're all taking a really long time. That stuff can stack up and get a little bit confusing. So I'm going to start off by talking about a bunch of requests I filed when I was reporting out a project that later became a book. It wasn't supposed to be a book project. The story kind of just demanded it as I went through my reporting. And so this book came out a couple years ago. It's about essentially adoption corruption in Guatemala, but it also is about a Florida-based adoption agency. And so again, kind of thinking back to that Joint Terrorism Task Force example, right? You think about which agencies are involved in the topic I'm thinking about. And so for this book, I came up with a short list of agencies that I was going to file FOIA requests to. The ones highlighted here are obviously the federal ones. And so for this project, I worked primarily with the Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, USCIS, ICE, Secret Service, FBI. And in the very beginning of my work, it was primarily DHS, FOIAs, and the Department of State. Department of State was sort of the bulk of laying out sort of the systems and background and context to this book. And as a little bit more background, the book is a true crime book. It looks at one particular crime, but it looks at it again within this really big context that got a lot bigger than I ever would have expected, thanks to federal FOIA requests. So I'm gonna share with you guys text of some requests. This is one of the first ones I filed. And when you file a request, your idea for asking for information always comes from somewhere, right? Either a tip, a source, something you've heard, something you're trying to corroborate or triangulate to verify. And so this request is actually a third-party authorization, which is something you do when you want information about someone that's maybe still alive that an agency won't give you information about due to privacy concerns and other laws like that. And so one of my sources, who is one of the main characters of that book, was named Betsy Emanuel, and she filed this request because I asked her to. I gave her the language, I sent her this exact template, and she filled in the blanks with her private information. And she was requesting information that was specific to her life and her experience, information that she had already told me about, but we wanted to see what do all the agencies have? What does this specific agency have to say? We wanted to see the correspondence about her case, about what happened in her adoption process, which again is outlined in the book. And so this was the text of that request. As always, she starts off, this is all standardized language. This section right here with bullet points 1, 2, 3, these are the specific asks we were making. As always, there's a date frame on there, and it's specific and it's also a little bit broad. You'll see the first one is just asking for correspondence about herself and her family with a date frame. Second one is email correspondence and other records, petitions, visa records related to the adoption of a child she was trying to adopt but could not. And then the third one, same thing, a different child she was trying to adopt that she could not. So she provided the Department of State with my contact information, saying that she was authorizing them to send all of this information directly to me, not to her. She used my standard language here. I should say I used, since I did write this for her. Of course, you include your typical fee disclaimer. It's pretty standard. It's not that different from any request you'd file. And then as a second part of that third-party authorization, I also sent in my own letter to the department saying, hey, I am certifying and declaring I am who I am. This is my residence. I'm the other party that is part of this request. And so that got sent in. And then you kind of wait. So that's one kind of request that's very specific. When I was thinking about the bigger picture, broader context, international relations, adoption, corruption, Guatemala, United States, embassy stuff, I started thinking pretty broadly about what information would exist and how. And so this here is another sample request I sent in. A lot of it is just standardized language that I repeated in almost 30 different requests I made to the Department of State. I kind of went a little bit nuts on this, but with great success, I will say. There is such value in going all in and going in kind of deep, but also sometimes being intentionally broad, but broad in a way that they can't deny, right? You can be broad, but you still have to have sort of the right perimeters around your request. So this specific request, again, is Department of State. I'm asking specifically for communications between the Department of State and a nonprofit organization called the Joint Council on International Children's Services that I knew from my reporting kind of act as a lobbying group and an advocacy group to keep adoptions open in the United States and to sort of promote them. And so I wanted to know what their emails looked like, what were they saying to State Department officials, all that good stuff, just to sort of get my head around the bigger picture. You'll see, so this section here, section 1, that just lists off exactly what I wanted from them, the details of the request. It's asking for, it's saying I'm interested in the following topics, specifically within the broad request. And then it, of course, includes a section on why I need the information, who I am, standardized information about the fees, why I think there should be a waiver in this case, time is of the essence, all that good stuff we always put in requests. Always, include a line about how they should release records as they obtain them. A federal agency could spend many months just trying to locate records that are responsive to your request. You want them to be sending you material as you go, not waiting 3 years until they have everything beautifully done, put a bow on it, send it to you. Not at all. You want it as it comes in. So that's okay to say. Thinking again about federal FOIAs, what's your beat? What do you want to corroborate? And create FOIAs from tips. So here are sort of related requests I made under that big umbrella, right? Again, to the State Department. I wanted correspondence between state and UNICEF concerning the processing of adoptions from Guatemala within a certain time frame, which is frankly an enormous time frame, right? Like you're going to ask for correspondence between 95 and 2008. That's a lot of years. When they got back to me, they told me which databases they searched for each of these requests. Here are a couple more. One was for correspondence between a particular official, a consul general that was in place in Guatemala at the time, at a time period I was interested in learning more about. Some of these requests were more focused on sort of topics here. So correspondence between the embassy in Guatemala, the US Embassy, and the Ministerio Público, which is the public prosecutor's office, specifically concerning fraud in adoption, communication, correspondence between a nonprofit that was helping women find their kidnapped children and the State Department, requests for information about fraud or suspicious activities in DNA testing by a specific company that was doing the DNA testing in adoptions. You can kind of just keep going and use your same template language. And so after you file all those federal requests you want to file on a particular topic, then it gets a little hard because you can go into it with a lot of enthusiasm, but then you have to stay the course. And that can be kind of discouraging sometimes, in that months and months go by, you don't know what's going on. You can keep calling your FOIA officer, asking them for updates, asking them for status updates, and they'll probably say, hey, we're working on it. It's in process, but you just have to keep going. And so at a certain point, you do have to decide whether or not getting a lawyer on board can help you. I strongly recommend doing that as early as possible in your process. For the specific project, I did not get a lawyer involved, but I did choose to use the federal ombudsman. So there's a government office called OGIS, the Office of Government Information Services, and they have an ombudsman that you can reach out to. I sent them this email. Also, this was about 2 years after I filed that batch of requests. I had also sent a kind of advocacy letter to the Secretary of State, who was Clinton at the time, saying, hey, help out with these requests. Journalism is public service, all that good stuff. You kind of have to be the squeaky wheel, however you can imagine doing so. And so OGIS was one step. Sent them all the requests, the timelines, status updates. You must keep meticulous notes on updates over time, so then you can bring it forward when either your lawyer needs them or someone like OGIS gets involved. OGIS's website is up. It is archives.gov/OGIS. And they also have a FOIA ombudsman blog. Don't put too many eggs in their basket, though. It's an option. Like many ombudsmans and HR departments in companies and organizations, you might not get the help you actually want. It is just an option. And so they do have forms you fill out. When I filled mine out, I was pretty salty. I used caps. Don't need to do that at all. And they wrote back, and they did try. They're able to check in with the State Department, get back to me, let me know what's going on, but it didn't do much else. I just kept on being told, hey, everything's in process. It's just going to take some time. So there was kind of nothing to do but wait. In the meantime, I got a trickle of information from some of the requests, certainly not all. And between 2 and 4 years later, much to my surprise, I never was told how much all of these documents would cost. No one ever told me whether my fee waivers would be approved or not. And I tell you guys this just to let you know that, while a lot of FOIA is really procedural, shit happens. Like stuff that is really unexpected or maybe impossible to even imagine can happen. And so in about 20, gosh, it was 3.5, 4 years after I filed all of those requests, that was when the big payday came from the Department of State, and I started getting boxes of documents at my apartment, literally boxes. One of them was over 10 pounds, and they were of material that was extremely useful. It was sort of like a FOIA Christmas, right? It's absolutely a joyous day when you get a big document cache. And what I received from those requests sort of spelled out the entire diplomatic history of international relations around the specific issue I was researching, adoption corruption in Guatemala. The documents revealed things that I frankly had no clue were happening at the point in which they were happening back in the 80s and the 90s. They spelled out sort of the beginning of the adoption industry in post-war and mid-war Guatemala. They spelled out allegations of murder multiple times throughout some of these documents, kidnappings, basically what the embassy knew and when, and then it went on and took it a step farther. And you're able to read in the consular officer's own, more or less personal emails, why they couldn't do anything and how very traumatized some of them were about seeing terrible crimes unfolding and just not being able to do anything, feeling like their hands were tied. And so after those boxes and boxes of documents did arrive, I was faced with, well, what do you do next? I had already turned in my book manuscript at that point. It was too late. And so for me, it seemed obvious you have to kind of pay it forward. And if you get a giant trove of information nobody else has, you have to just try to make it open source somehow, right? So on one hand, I took the documents, made excerpts, packaged them into a self-published book and just stuck it on Amazon for accessibility. And I also donated the original materials to the National Security Archives in DC, which are free for anyone to go and review. It also resulted in other stories that of course come up based on the material that's in those documents, which is another, another possibility that comes when you are FOIAing with a broader lens. Again, I wanted to stress getting lawyers involved earlier is always a good thing. FOIA lawsuits, you might think if you're not in a traditional newsroom, you don't have a staff attorney, getting someone to represent you in a FOIA suit might seem like a tall ask. It's really not. There's lots of organizations that exist to help. These are a few of my favorite. The Gumshoe Group is relatively new. It was founded by Seth Wessler and Azmat Khan, two incredible investigative journalists, and they exist specifically to help freelancers. If you have a question about a federal FOIA, whether it's the crafting of it, whether it's obtaining status updates, whether it's just kind of, if you need a gut check on whether things seem to be transpiring in an appropriate fashion, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press has a hotline you can reach out. They always have either a lawyer or a legal intern who will get back to you pretty expeditiously. They are absolutely magnificent. There is also a new resource by the Vance Center, which pairs lawyers with reporters. That one I just learned about actually this week. There's more options than ever before when it comes to finding pro bono counsel, and it is absolutely in your best interest to get that counsel on the case as soon as possible. So as soon as a federal agency misses their deadline for responding to you when you file that first request, say the statute of limitations is 20 days, it's gone. Fire off a threatening note from a lawyer. And sometimes that just tends to loosen up information, and that can get things to you much sooner than later. There's also one particular book I would recommend. It is dense and academic and hard to read, but it spells out the intricacies of litigating a FOIA case. And I feel like that's kind of good to know. It's called Litigation Under the Federal Open Government Laws. There's a 2000, 2002, 2004, 2010 edition. And the folks that wrote it are currently working on an updated version, but a lot of that stuff still stands in the 2010 version. So that's another resource that I encourage folks to check out.
That's excellent. That information it's amazing how much they sent you, all those boxes.
I was shocked, frankly.
And we have a question actually from one of the participants who are listening in right now. They wanted to know, who are the hardest agencies to get requests processed with? When I saw this question pop up, I immediately thought, I feel like every federal agency in my experience. Most recently I've dealt with the Coast Guard, the FBI, and it's just taken a long time. But how about you? What are your thoughts on that?
So I feel like this question is really hard to answer as an individual. It's much more accurate to answer it from like an aggregated data perspective. So if you look at a place like TRAC, right? TRAC's website, Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, Project Syracuse, they actually do the homework and have the stats per year of who takes the longest, who fields the most requests. All that data is there. I don't know it off the top of my head. In my personal experience, I find an agency like the FBI, they're great at sending out their acknowledgements really quickly. Like you'll get an acknowledgement from the FBI in like 3 days sometimes, right? Like great. But then they can sit on your request for a year. So, after Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, I was like, well, hey, I'm going to get her FBI file because why not? That sounds interesting. And it wasn't for a story, it wasn't for a project. It's literally because I just get interested in more things. And I kind of figured that's an easy one. She's dead. Everyone knows she's dead. There's no reason for them to deny anything.
Mm-hmm.
I filed that request in September 2020. I haven't heard a word since.
Oh, wow.
Admittedly, I haven't followed up. I haven't threatened them. I haven't gotten a lawyer involved because that part's not worth my time. And that is something you really have to think about when you're filing federal requests. They do require a lot of follow through. You have to be that squeaky wheel consistently in order to hit your payday, I think. I will say the USDA has been pretty quick for me. Department of Agriculture has been okay. I will say CBP, Customs and Border Enforcement, they're the worst. And I will say, I think they're authoritatively the worst because they've even won, I want to say it was like 2020, maybe 2019, the IRE Golden Padlock Award. I mean, it's a little bit universal. They drag their heels, and it can be so hard to get something as simple as a staffing organizational chart at a CBP,
Wow,
which is like, come on, guys, that's
I know.
right.
And I think we have another question too. Somebody wants to know, have you ever played one agency against the other, say state versus federal or FBI versus DHS? And is that a good or bad?
I mean, okay, so the idea of playing one off the other doesn't quite make sense. What you can do though is like triangulate information from various agencies to further like sharpen your request, right? So, you know, say you want to find out about like one, I don't know, one like international kidnapping, and so you think it's like FBI, CIA, DHS is going to have stuff. You know, file that more or less the same request to each agency. Maybe one gives you information first. You know, use what you have to then like send another request to those other two agencies. But you know, the fact that one agency might turn over information quicker, I mean, I think most of us kind of have a sense of how agencies don't really care. Like there is absolutely kind of like a, you know, where the better agency kind of competition that can happen from time to time. And they don't care if, you know, okay, FBI, CIA, FBI doesn't care what the CIA is doing. Yeah. No, that'd be my take. That's just my opinion. I am.
Yeah, no, gotcha. So another person we have a question, want to know, is there something you really, really wanted but could never get when doing the research for your book?
Yeah. So, okay, by the time I got all those boxes of documents, I mean, it was a lot, right? There were a couple of loose ends that I never fully kind of came to grips with, but that was kind like you have to prioritize it. Like when you're working on any reporting project, right? It's pretty easy to over report. So you have to draw a line in the sand around like, okay, that would be nice to get, but do I really need that? And so there were things that I was interested in, like DNA fraud for one, where I had a lot of tips and allegations from very credible sources, but I wasn't able to triangulate the information enough to be like, yup, that's something that's publishable. At the same time, that like that was like a whole that could be a whole different project, and it wasn't as tied to the book as I would have needed it to be to prioritize, I would say.
And we got another question too. And I'm curious to know your answer.
Yeah.
What's the longest time it's taken you to get something from a federal agency?
4 years. Yeah.
Okay.
Years for sure. I mean, sometimes, yeah, sometimes here's another hack. You know, you can look on the internet and see which agencies have FOIA logs. Some of them do. DHS kept them all for a while. I think the Trump administration rearranged some of these government websites. So like where a FOIA log once was is maybe not the same as it was 4 years ago, a couple years ago. But if you go through the FOIA logs, you can see who's requested what and when. And somebody may have requested information that kind of fits under what you're looking for. And so it might be advantageous to ask for a duplicate set of responses to somebody else's request. I've done that before. It's also kind of a sneaky way to see what other people are up to and what they might be reporting on. So if you are a super competitive reporter, you know, you can kind of see. Actually, I will say though, on the flip side, there are also some drawbacks. I was working on another book project that is still backburnered, and it looked at a criminal organization in Tijuana that launders a lot of money. Everybody knows that. That's like not a surprise. But I was really interested in getting documents from the US government around a multi-task force investigation that everyone knows existed because pieces of it were leaked like back in the 90s. And so I was filing a couple of requests to DHS, not thinking about the FOIA logs, and your name shows up next to like the narco you're asking about. And you have to just be, if you're doing anything that's a little bit sensitive, you just have to be a little bit careful because that information being out there is not the safest. So when I realized that happened, I was like, all right, you know what? I'm gonna back burner this project for a couple of years and then maybe I'll pick that back up later. So
Wow. What's the best way for people to order your book? You know, if they're interested in checking it out? I know I am.
Thank you. I mean, it's sold everywhere, like Amazon, IndieBound, all
Mhm.
those good places. Bookshop is a good place because they send money back to independent bookstores. My publisher is Beacon Press out of Boston. You can
Mhm.
get it, I think, directly from them on their website. They're an amazing organization to support. They have some great work. So thank you.
Great, great. Well, Erin, thank you so much for joining us today, and I want to thank everybody who tuned in. We're going to be posting this on NEFAC's YouTube channel, and yeah, again, thank you so much, Erin. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.